Welcome, Duke alumni and friends, to this session of the Duke Alumni Forever Learning Institute. I'm Eli Kline, Program Coordinator for the Duke Entertainment, Media, and Arts Network, DEMAN, in alumni engagement, and I'm thrilled to have you with us today. Thank you so much for joining us for the Universal Language, the fourth and final session part of our music appreciation series. In this session, we will explore how the idea of whether music can be considered a universal language and in what way music can connect individuals from diverse backgrounds and facilitates expression beyond words. We'll have time for a Q&A at the end, so feel free to drop your questions in the chat as we go along, but I will ask you to stay muted. Now, I'm delighted to introduce our moderator, Alan Nelson. Alan leads Clark Hill's fractional general counsel practice. He graduated cum laude from Duke's Trinity College in 1986 with an AB in History and Religion. He was a J.R. Parkinson Memorial Scholar at the Duke University School of Law. Alan has been involved in a wide range of alumni-related activities, including serving on the Duke Law Alumni Association Board of Directors, serving as co-chair of Duke Atlanta, as well as being involved in the Duke ESQ program and teaching at Winter Session. Welcome to the Forever Learning Institute, Alan. We're so glad to have you here. Thank you.
Great, Eli. Thank you very much. I have to add the thing that, frankly, of all my activities with Duke, I'm most proud of. I'm also the father of an alum. My daughter graduated in 2019, so I'm very excited about that. So thank you for folks for joining us today. I think this is a really interesting topic, and I'm delighted. I've had the opportunity to listen to previous programs from this series, and it's just a fascinating series of things. What we're going to talk about today, and we're going to introduce our speakers in just a moment, we're going to talk about the question of whether music is a universal language. And quite frankly, before I was asked about this, I never, frankly, had even thought about the topic. But I think it's a fascinating topic, and it really, I think, really brings into play various things about, frankly, humanity, culture, shared experience and not shared experience. And so I think there are really a lot of different themes that we will explore here. I recently read a book. It's actually about visual art, painting. I, for whatever reason, have an interest in people who sadly steal physical art, visual art. It's a book called The Art Thief by Michael Finkel, and Finkel writes about general preferences for art and what people really like, and what we don't like, and colors we like, and thoughts that we like. And he basically talks about the fact that at the end of the day, there are actually some theological aspects of how people perceive art and think about art. And so what he's talking about, and again, a slightly different context, is the juxtaposition of preferences or cultural learning that we have and visceral aspects of responses to, in this case, again, visual art. And I certainly think it provides to me, a really interesting dynamic to discuss music and reactions to music. And so we're going to explore that a bit today. The two folks that we have with us today, I've certainly been delighted to get to know them in the process here. Darren Mueller and Beth Linnartz, I'm going to let them introduce themselves because they can certainly tell their stories far better than I. Then we'll jump into the topic. Beth, if you could just start off by giving the folks gathered here a little bit of your background and how you come to this moment.
Well, I was an accidental music major at Duke and Trinity College because math bombed out and so did religion, but music was really fun. So I married a Duke lawyer. We went off to work in seminaries. We got a seminary degree and worked in seminaries in Indonesia and the Philippines. And in the meantime, had 5 kids. And then things didn't work out in that marriage, so I ended up bringing my 5 kids back to the States, getting my doctorate in music, and I've been teaching at Duke since 2004. 3 of my 5 kids are alums, so it's been an interesting life. And music has been a big part of it and a small part of it, depending on the situation. So I'm happy to be teaching Duke students now to sing. It's a wonderful job.
That's great, Beth. Thank you. Darren?
Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm happy to be here. I started at Duke in 2008 as a graduate student in musicology. I came to Duke by way of a number of institutions from the University of Colorado, where I did my undergraduate in saxophone performance, and then at Rutgers University, where I studied jazz history as attached to the Institute of Jazz Studies, the largest archive of jazz in the world. And I really enjoyed my time at Duke. I miss Durham a lot. I now live in Rochester, New York. I joined the faculty at the Eastman School of Music in 2016. I'm still here teaching music of all kinds, classical, jazz, whatever I have at my fingertips. And I've really enjoyed my time here, but I always think about my experience at Duke as just such a wonderful time and so generative in so many ways. My wife is also a Duke alum as well in the music department. And so we bring our experiences from Duke with us and kind of wherever we go. But I'm happy to be here sharing some talk about music, which is, of course, one of my favorite subjects.
That's great. Beth and Darren, thank you so much for being here. Folks who are gathered here with us, please, as you have questions, please put them in the chat. We will certainly make every effort to get those questions out. We have an hour-long session. And we certainly want to get your thoughts as well. So do not hesitate, please. While we will have a session at the end, or a portion of the session at the end, to entertain questions, please don't hesitate to put the questions up in chat, and we will we'll go from there. All right, so let's start with kind of the big question. This was represented as a discussion of whether music is a universal language. For those of us who are of a certain age, we will remember on 60 Minutes the point counterpoint session. I don't know that we're going to get into the point counterpoint kind of discussion here, but I do think there are different views and different thoughts about this. So with that, Beth, what is your thought, on the main question that we're talking about? Is music a universal language?
My experience is that music is universal, but it's not a universal language, because just like with spoken languages, the words, the vocabulary, the grammar, the syntax, the whole way that you use a language and the things that a language highlights or ignores, that is true in music as well. And so just like you find many languages around the world, you find many different musics.
Darren, your thoughts?
I'm actually in a lot of agreement with Beth and the way that she has presented this, especially the idea of music being universal. We find it in almost every culture around the world, and in many different capacities. But as a language, there are differences that are legible to those of us on the outside, and there are differences that are illegible. And sometimes also, even within a culture, you can have a piece of music that people love or find to be very jarring or what have you. I teach 20th century music to Eastman undergraduates. A lot of those undergraduate students don't have a lot of experience with 20th century music. And so sometimes I will play challenging music for them, and they walk away, and sometimes they're just like, I don't even think this is music. And there's also someone sitting in the corner, a composer, who's just like, this is the most amazing music, and I love this so much. And so I see this in my classes every day. I see this in the conversations that I have as well. And in fact, it's that tension between what people like and don't, and those differences of opinion, that make music such a wonderful experience for all of us. And it's what makes it interesting and gives it life in a lot of ways. If we had just one way of thinking about music, I don't think it would be as broad and interesting as it is.
So Beth, playing off that theme, so Beth, you're teaching folks vocal music, singing regularly. I mean, what is your experience? Because you've, again, as you mentioned in your introduction, you've traveled the world and heard all sorts of different traditions. If memory serves from our discussions, you've spent a lot of time on what some people call church music, stuff that's, religious in nature and the like. What's been your experience as you've listened to and taught vocal music, I mean, literally again, globally at this point?
So actually in Indonesia, I taught church music, but prior to that, we went to West Java to learn the Indonesian language in a practical manner. So we learned it by speaking rather than by studying a grammar. And during that time, we were living in a Sundanese community. And Sundanese gamelan, so you may know that gamelan is an orchestra of instruments, a lot of xylophones or brass xylophones, and then a few other instruments like a drum, maybe a one-stringed instrument, and so forth, gongs. So it's many people, and the Sundanese gamelan was pentatonic. That is, it had 5 notes that you could play on a piano. I just happen to have one here. So that's pentatonic. And the notes that they were using could fit on a piano. So their gamelan music made sense to me. We lived there a year, and then we moved to East Java, where the culture is Javanese, which is a very highly developed culture. And their gamelan, so a gamelan, you have a xylophone in front of you and then one beside you, and everybody's xylophone that's in front is tuned to one scale, and the xylophone here is tuned to another scale. So they'll do much of the music on one instrument, and then there's a signal from the drum and they do it on the other one. So in what we think of as music, there's 12 tones. There's A sharp, B, C, C sharp, and so forth. There's 12 notes. In Sundanese gamelan, there's just the 5 notes. But in Javanese, the xylophone in front of you has an octave divided into 5 equal parts. Well, that doesn't fit on the piano at all. And then when you switch, now you're in an octave that's divided in 7 equal parts. That doesn't fit on a 12-tone instrument either. And so when I first heard the Javanese gamelan, we lived in a village, if a village has a wedding, then you rent refrigerator-sized speakers, you put 6 or 8 of them outside your house, and you play music 24 hours a day for 3 days. The evening music was always Javanese gamelan. And probably for the first 9 months, it just sounded like somebody crashing on garbage can lids to me. I just couldn't hear the music of it. And I did learn from having to learn a bunch of Russian songs for a linguist conference. I found out that your synapses have to grow in when you learn a new phoneme. You actually have to grow a new space in your brain for a new phoneme. So it's hard to get the phonemes right in a new language until that happens. And I think that for Javanese gamelan, at some point, the mental hardware must have been there, because I was up in the night, pregnant with a big belly, looking out over a moonlit volcanic valley, and the gamelan was playing again, and suddenly it just like fit. It just suddenly went into, oh, now I get it. Now it sounds like music to me. But at first it just didn't sound like music. So that was a really valuable experience to be saturated in that music until it made sense. So I do think that what we've been exposed to is what we like.
Right.
Yeah.
So you and I have discussed on the times we've been together previously, similar concepts around culture and place and history and all that. Can you just play off what Beth just shared with us in that regard?
Oh yeah, sure. First of all, the story that Beth recounts actually reminded me a lot of my own experience, but a little bit closer to home. I was a saxophone major in college, and jazz was my focus. That was the thing that I loved the most. But I really struggled with John Coltrane, and John Coltrane is one of the most important figures in jazz history, especially as a saxophonist. Uh, you will find no one more beloved and talked about than John Coltrane in the history of jazz. But I was very much struggling with exactly how to make sense of this music. And there was a time in which it was almost like a crisis of kinds, where here I am, a jazz saxophonist who can't understand the biggest and most important figure in uh, in the history, until I spent a lot of time with it trying to wrestle with this problem, and then it did click finally, and it was a relief to me because I felt like maybe something was wrong with me. Fortunately, I just like needed to like kind of get on the same page in a way. And in some ways I do think there is something about the sort of physiological and the brain chemistry that's necessary for that. And that can happen sort of close to home with things that you're really familiar with, and that can also happen in other capacities as well. So that's one thing that comes to mind. The other thing that comes to mind is just how when we are exposed to music that we are not familiar with, we often try to make comparisons with what we are familiar with. And so if there is a context for that, it can be easy to do that. Um, if there's no context for that, that can be very hard to do. And there are often times in which we try to grasp with a comparative lens, and that can be really valuable, but then it can also sort of put us into a place where we're not sure how to quite work our way out. And that sort of encounter, that sort of sonic encounter or cultural encounter, I think is actually really important for us to sort of grow as people, but it can be deeply uncomfortable, and it can take a lot to sort of work through. Um, and Linda, I see in the chat the first time listening to Thelonious Monk, and I had the same experience as well. So we are in we feel the same in that way. And I'd be curious to know if that had changed for you as you listened, or if you ever felt a aha moment for that.
Right, right. One of the things, Darren, I wanted to, and I've taken the time, you were kind enough to share a couple of your publications, one of which is a book called At the Vanguard of Vinyl, A Cultural History of the Long Playing Record in Jazz. And it's a fascinating book. I think it's Duke University Press, I believe.
Duke University Press, yeah, stayed home, at least in that way. I love Duke University Press. So I was very happy to have that connection.
Plug there, shameless plug. But one of the interesting concepts that you bring out in that, and this is not a session on necessarily the methods of distributing music on the one hand, but on the other hand, is we talk about universality, potential universality of music. I was born in the 1960s, and you got music from singles and vinyl, and you got them if the record store had them. And that was kind of it. I mean, you also had traditions. I grew up in the church, and we heard music in the church and all that. I get that. But that's how you got your music. Now, the distribution methods take music from all over the world. Each one of us on this call right now can go find music, Javanese music right now. It'll take less than 3 seconds to get 1,000 songs. How does that play into the concept of, or does it play into the concept of music as a universal language? And we're going to get to cultural appropriation in a minute, because I think it's a fascinating topic as well. But how do you feel about that, Darren, in terms of, the distribution of music and the kind of breaking down of geographic barriers and maybe arguably cultural barriers?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. It's a really question of our times in a lot of ways. When we have access to music, great things can happen. But I think there's a thing that also happens with that, is that when we have access to so much music and it's all through the same platform, everything kind of starts to flatten out in a way where you can just type in and say, I'll use jazz examples: John Coltrane, Thelonious Monk, Terence Blanchard, Mary Lou Williams. All of a sudden everything is just so easily got that the lack of friction there means that you don't have to like actually make decisions in a way. And I see this with my students sometimes, where everything exists on a flat timeline, where they're just like, oh well, here's all this stuff, and the differences between those, maybe that's from different cultures, maybe that's from different time periods, sometimes gets lost in a way where you don't sit with the decision of finding it and you're searching for a record or you're saving up for a record and you get it and then you finally get it. You get to sit down with it. You get to read the liner notes. You get to sit with it in a real different kind of way. And so I think it's like look, I'm an academic, so I'm going to hand wave here. On the one hand, you have the ability to find all of these sounds from all around the world, which is amazing. On the other hand, the differences do get flattened out because we don't spend the time that we used to have to really find a way of understanding that. And so I think that both of those things can be true and at odds with one another. And it's something that I actively try to address in my classes as well, to just say like, well, how do we access music? And just because we don't see it because it's in a browser or on a streaming service, that doesn't mean that there aren't elements that we need to consider about the distribution pathways, the environmental concerns involved with making music accessible in that way, which is certainly an element in AI as well. We have to think about musicians and how they're paid and how they're not paid as much now that they're streaming. A lot of these streaming platforms are also using AI-generated things for their playlists. So what does that mean for live music making? And it's not to say that it's all bad. It just means that the dynamics are, they're real life. They're not just something that's just as easy as putting John Coltrane into a search bar.
Got it.
There's also somewhat of a diminishment when music is only from a screen or from a recording. Being in a live performance makes a huge difference. And then also being a performer, whether it's amateur or professional, making music has a completely different effect on you than just being in music that has a completely different effect than just hearing it.
And Beth, can I ask a follow-up? Because the gamelan ensemble is one of those like very visceral experiences because it can be so overwhelming. Was that your experience when in these different capacities?
I did get to go to some different performances live. And so the one that was in the night, of course, that was recorded, but the live ones it was so interesting to see the individuals. For example, the gamelan players are all men. And the first half of the song or whatever piece would be sort of slow. And then the tempo picked up. And in the slow part, all the guys were just doing their pattern. They really looked like they were nearly dead. They were old guys. And then the drum made a different tone and they went to the other part of they got into a more excited rhythm and they all woke up because the dancing girls came in. So it was just, it was fun to see the human element. I actually got to play in a gamelan orchestra a little bit and it was really boring. You're just doing your little pattern back and forth because you're just one little cog in a very complex rhythmic wheel. But it was fun to see what woke them up, so.
So one of the things, Beth, you and I talked about, if memory serves, you've done a lot of work in the Baroque era of music. I think I'm remembering that correctly. And part of the discussion we had is really the complexity of that music from a particular era. And indeed, just going back to jazz, because that's what we talked about, the complexity of certain aspects of modern music, whether you call it jazz or not, I mean, it doesn't really matter, but more modern music. I mean, those sorts of things, they kind of translate over time, right? I mean, how do you think about that?
Actually, I see a lot of similarities between Baroque and jazz, especially in performance practice, because the keyboard player is making up a lot of what they do off of a chart in both traditions. There's room for each person to improvise and have a solo. People move when they do Baroque music. They move when they do jazz. It's not very formal. It's a lot of fun. So,
right.
That may be what we talked about. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And that's when at least when I think about it, that's it's across cultures, it's across centuries, it's across a lot of different things, yes. And yet there comes the same sort of structure and and interesting building blocks. Again, Thelonious Monk is
Mhm.
a fantastic example of that. Coltrane also, and others. But again, it's not a.
Alan,
Yes, go right
can I
ahead.
add a point here? I was just thinking also about the Baroque, and another kind of element of just kind of is this, kind of the universality of language, I think, or of music, I should say, is, in the Baroque era, the tuning was quite different than what we consider modern day tuning as well. And so if we think back across eras as well, like if we just think about our experience of music has changed quite dramatically. Not just in terms of streaming services, but also just in terms of like what note was considered an A or a C. And certain eras, like it differed wildly. There were different countries that had different standards of tuning, often at odds, like violent odds against one another. There were big fights. There were fights among the scientists and the musicians at one point. It was in treaties, and there were instruments that were built. There's all these kinds of things in which even something as simple as what is the note C and how do we define that has differed over time and over locations. And so in this idea of universality, it also is just like, well, there's a very interesting history about just what the standard of tuning is.
Well, and I think, Darren, when we discussed before this session, it's actually in the Treaty of Versailles,
It is.
correct?
This is an amazing fact that I did not know until recently. I read a great book by Fanny Gravinsky, who's a professor at NYU, called "Tuning the World," and she has this great fact about after World War II, when the standardization of pitch was in the Treaty of Versailles for like all of
World
these
War,
reasons. Sorry,
World War,
I got really excited about this. I'm sorry.
no. I want to finish short, but it's World War One, of course. Treaty of Versailles is
Oh
World War.
yeah, sorry. World War One. My mistake, of course. Yes, and the reason why is because at that time in Europe, it was such a hotly contested issue that when they finally decided the treaties, they needed to have some standards, and included in those standards of because trade was so dependent on the standards, also musical instruments and things like that was also included by that. So yeah, I got too excited, so I actually had the wrong history there, which is shameful for a history professor.
That's okay. We've had a question about from Mark about the decolonization of the language of music, which I think is an interesting question. I think that kind of leads into the concept of appropriation, or some would argue misappropriation. Darren, I know you've got something that you shared with us earlier that would probably fit right into that discussion. And I know there's an audio piece that you have. Is that you have that available to share?
Yeah, sure. Just give me a minute. And forgive me for going into professor mode here. This is what I'll do versions of this in my classes as well. So just
Beth got to play the piano, so you get to do audio.
Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen. Can everyone see this? Just Alan, give me a thumbs up to make sure
Yes.
that that's okay, good. I wanted to play a little example from Caroline Shaw's Partita for 8 Voices, which is this a cappella piece written for a group that she's in called Roomful of Teeth. This piece was awarded the Pulitzer Prize in 2013. I actually saw Roomful of Teeth at Duke. I think it was around that time, maybe 2014. And they performed this piece as well. Shaw became the youngest recipient of the Pulitzer for music. Now, this is a piece in which there's 4 movements. They're all named after Baroque dances. And actually, sorry, I'm going to go back to the other slide here. And one of the things that Shaw does is you can see this quote at the bottom here about her approach to music making, in which she really highlights, this is her own website, about how she moves among different roles and genres and mediums, trying to explore different sounds. And in this piece, she borrows techniques from numerous places around the world. And so the reason why I bring this up is because there is musical borrowing to make this piece that is largely considered to be one of the great pieces of the 21st century. So I wanted to play a little bit of the third movement here. And so let's see if So the piece goes on. There's actually a really beautiful section a little bit later on, about 3 minutes in, that is a quotation of a Civil War era hymn tune, and it's sung by the choir. And it's really beautifully executed. There's all these different layers of sound. Now, one of the things that happened was soon after, or I guess a few years later, Shaw was criticized by an Inuit throat singer named Tanya Tagaq, who is a composer in her own right. And you can see the quote here. And there was this question of appropriation. Because the third movement, which we just talked about, was based on Inuit throat singing. And Tagaq had a criticism of just the way that this piece sort of sounded and her experience of it, being someone who is Inuit herself. And the issue here is that it's not as clear about what exactly, I'm not offering a correct stance on this, but it's just to say that when Roomful of Teeth and Caroline Shaw made this music, they did work with an Inuit throat singer, and they paid this person for their time. They brought them in and did workshops with them, but they were not credited. And so the question of like, where is the music coming from, and who gets the prizes, who gets the awards? The reason I thought about this is because we have the same sounds, the same musical sounds that on the one hand can be read as sort of this musical piece where there's a lot of joy and enjoyment from it. If you are of a certain position, maybe the Pulitzer Prize committee, but then if you are someone with Indigenous descent, maybe you're hearing this and having a very, very different experience for it. And so it kind of raises the question of like, well, how do we wrestle with these ideas? And I don't think that there's a right answer from myself. I don't ask my students to have a right answer either, but I use it to sort of say, music and art is very complicated, and it's the complications of where we sit and what our position is that actually makes it so such a worthy pursuit and something worth kind of our attention, which is one of our most valuable resources.
So that's a great example, and thank you for sharing with us. So Beth, from your perspective, again, this is a vocal piece that you've just heard and Darren just shared. As you are, kind of a two-part question for you. As you have taught students in vocal performance, has what they want to do changed over time? Or, and maybe you drive that, I'm just asking, but, you know, has it changed? And if so, are they expanding kind of the cultural aspects of what they want to do?
So my students, I'm a firm believer in students should choose the music that they do. So I offer them lots of choices. The more I get to know someone and their tastes, the more I can tailor it. But I think that I don't want to make them practice. I want to entice them to practice. And so finding music that they love makes a difference. I've had students that are now performers not only in opera, but also old time, bluegrass, jazz. I have someone who just recorded a CD with John Brown at Duke. And so so I teach them the technique and how to keep their voices healthy, and what they do with it is whatever they want to do. I have a student who came to Duke to be a doctor. His parents may hate me, but he ended up majoring in voice, getting a master's in jazz, and now he sings with the U.S. Navy Chorus. And of course, that opens many, many doors for workshops and things. But I think my most intriguing experience with a student who was interested in a really wide variety of things was a Duke student who had injured her voice and needed someone who could help her get it healthy again. And I didn't know that on her senior recital, she would do some of her own compositions, do Jewish music, bel canto, a lot of opera, Carnatic music, for which she had been studying with a teacher for 2 years, and jazz. She was attending classes at Central as well as Duke at the same time so that she could study jazz. So she was basically apprenticing herself to 3 different traditions while writing music and singing in her synagogue. And all of that appeared in her recital, her senior recital. She ended with, Summertime, or My Man's Gone Now from Porgy and Bess, because I thought that incorporated opera, Jewish music, and jazz. So that was fun. But I didn't realize that she had her eye on a particular job. She had joined the Country Music Association. She got a Fulbright teaching in India. And she took my vocal health workshops and gave them to Carnatic singers in India. So this was very cross-cultural. She was looking at world musics, and now she is the Sony Masterworks Artists and Repertoire representative.
Oh, that's fantastic.
So yes, but her eye was, I don't want to just know classical music, and I don't just want to know bel canto. I want to know all these different classical musics, including jazz and Carnatic. So that was an eye-opener for me. But that's what you can do with good vocal technique. You can do an hour-and-a-half recital where you sing in many different styles and you don't kill your voice. So that's what I do.
Right. So Darren, I know, having read some of your work and having, conversed with you about this, the role of cultural influences is tremendously important in how you view things and how you view music. Can you just share a little bit about that, please?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. Trying to think of the way. I will just, as I'm thinking about the best way of response, I will say I got a call from John Brown yesterday. I used to play with him when I was at Duke, and he called me on, and he's like, he asked me, he's like, "Are you going to be in Durham?" Because he wanted to know. He's like, "Why haven't I heard from you?" And so I had to tell him that I was joining this call from Rochester, New York. But he did call me, so I was happy to have that connection there again, back from the music department there. But maybe I can just tell you a little bit about my own story. I grew up in Boulder, Colorado. I fell in love with jazz from a very young age. I was listening to Charlie Parker when I was in 6th grade, and that was my entry into a whole world. I went through many, many years of jazz education in high school. I was in all state bands. I majored in music. I did a master's degree at Rutgers in jazz history. But it was really only until that latter part in which I turned to academia, in which I really wrestled with the fact that jazz was coming from Black America. And what the reason for that are many, but there was a kind of a system in which jazz education was not willing to deal with the really complex history of the music and how race and class and gender were all implicated in the way that the music was formed, the way that it was received, the way that it was distributed and marketed. There's all of these elements that went into it. And because of that education, I mean, again, a lot from the people who I met at Duke, I really had to wrestle with the question of why I was not taught that history. I was taught a different history. And so my work since that time has been really dedicated to understanding what we call, in my world, historiography, the way that history is told, the kinds of investments that we have and what kinds of stories are told and not. History is very contested. It is contested today in numerous elements. If you want to talk about wars that are happening around the world, history is a part of those. If you want to talk about politics at home, the way that history is talked about is very, very meaningful to people. And in part, that's because of the values that we have. And I think it's a really important way of sort of understanding history as something that is of the present as well, no matter kind of where you're coming from or what your beliefs are. I do think that understanding music from the cultural investments that we have is really important.
Right. Beth, your thoughts on this topic?
Well, I do a lot of spirituals, and they come from the tradition of enslaved people. And I've agonized over whether I should sing them or not. And Louise Toppin, who's probably the best expert in spirituals, definitely believes that everyone should sing them, but we should sing them as they're written down and not fix the language and not fix anything, but treat them as an art song and really do them well. So that's what I do. But I do, and I have talked to to friends who would have a perspective on it. And so, yeah.
Right, and I guess some of that, depending on kind of what you read, when you say, kind of change how it's written, it's kind of like reading Zora Neale Hurston, who wrote in the language that was the language and genuine, and that's kind of the point. Just an aside real quick, I happened to yesterday be on a flight and watched a documentary. Some of you may have seen it. I had not seen it and was not even familiar with it. But there's a documentary out called Soundtrack to a Coup d'etat, and it's about by Johann Gimenprez, and it's the story of the intersection of jazz, the CIA, the Soviet Union, and the States of Congo, of Congo, and frankly, ultimately, the assassination of the first leader of the independent Congo. It's a fascinating tale, and it's for anyone who cares about the role of music in world politics, well worth watching. It's really fascinating, and it's kind of somewhat a bad tale in the sense of how governments use cultural ambassadors and music to impose political will. That's just my personal view. It's not the view of Duke University or anyone else, it's just my view. But it's a fascinating story about how, jazz music was used in a particular political way. And there's another view. Yeah, the name of it again is Soundtrack to a Coup d'etat. That was a question that was just asked by Manisha. Soundtrack to a Coup d'etat just came out in 2024. It's a fascinating story, actually. So in any event, all right. So we're coming into our last 15 minutes. What I'd like to do, Beth and Darren, is to give you both an opportunity not to give closing comments, but just kind of key concepts that you think we haven't really touched yet. And then I'd like to open it up for questions. Again, folks, if you've got questions, please put them in the chat and we'll work through that. That's going to be a lot easier than doing live verbal questions. So with that, Beth, kind of thoughts that you have on the topic and the view. I mean, again, you've covered a lot of great topics, but is there anything that you've not been able to cover that you wanted to cover?
I think that music, for many people, in many musics, has an ability to convey meaning beyond words. And if you've experienced that, you value that. And the more you value music, the more useful it is, or the more touching it is, the more you're willing to invest in it, I think. I think that music has an ability to reach the innermost part of human beings, and we all long for that. We get sort of trapped in our protection walls, and music breaks through. I see that many times. There's another documentary I would like to recommend that talks about music and memory and loss of memory and returning to yourself, and it's called Alive Inside. You may have seen a clip of it with Oliver Sacks on YouTube, but the whole documentary is incredibly worth watching. If you're a member of the Duke Library, you can watch it on your computer through that, but I'm sure you'd be able to find it on Amazon or something like that. Alive Inside. It's very enlightening, and it's not just one culture either. So,
Got it. Cool, Darren.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I tell my students a lot is that your experience as a listener really matters. And this is often a little bit jarring to them as history students, because they just assume that I'm going to tell them all the right answers. And I say, actually, no, what's really important is your experience with this music. And the reason I was thinking about that is because of what, Alan, you were just talking about with this idea of connection of music to politics. and again, I will just play my role here as a music historian, is that if you look at the music of the post-war period after World War II, you have a lot of abstract, very difficult music. I had a colleague once call it the bleep boop music, where it just sounds like it's very abstract. There's all these sounds. It's very inaccessible in a lot of ways. But the reason that music exists is because of what happened with the Nazis during World War II. And they adopted German composers as the height of the race, and they used it for all these political purposes. And so Beethoven and Brahms and Wagner, etc. And so the composers in the post-war moment did not want to make music that was going to be politically co-optable. And they wanted to create music that was so abstract that nobody would ever use it for a political purpose, which is its own kind of political statement as well. But I bring this up is because our experience really matters for how we understand music, and understanding what the composers are and how it's connected to politics can certainly matter, but our experience does change depending on the knowledge that we gain, and the more knowledge that we gain, the different experience that we have. But I think we also need to take our own reactions to music very seriously and interrogate those, not necessarily as given fact, but also as a place for question and as a place for inquiry, and hopefully as a place for connection as well.
Yes.
Right. And I before I open it up to anyone who has additional questions, so if you do have questions, please put them in the chat. I think, you know, the overall theme or the overall question here is music a universal language. As I shared both Beth with you and with Darren, I can this day, 30 years on, hear my grandmother singing in church a particular song. And I can imagine that there are people, you know, Javanese folks, Germans, South Africans, Brazilians, all who have these things in their minds, and they are, you know, touchstones of life. They are memories of family. They're all these things. And so while going all the way back to the beginning, Beth, from your comments, you know, they're different vocabulary and all those sorts of things. The concept is still there. I think it's just innate. I think it's just innate in us, and it's you know, tremendously important from that perspective. So do we have questions from? I think we've addressed some of them there. Do we have other questions coming in from folks? We've given time, but I can certainly ask more. I got a bunch. It's all good. All right, I'm going to jump back in. So, as we think about wait, hold on, not a question. Okay. Let's see. There's a reference someone's put in about a book called Listen on Music, Sound, and Us by Michelle Faber or Michael Faber. I'm not sure how to pronounce that. It's a good one. So that's worth knowing. So as we think about kind of the future, I mean, how do each of you see, let's take it 10, 20, 30 years down the road? I mean, the role of music and the interplay of various cultural aspects of music, and let's even talk about indigenous music in various cultures. How does that change over time? I mean, it changed clearly. What do you see that happening in a world that's increasingly global and increasingly, you know, I've said this recently, you know, you go online, you can get music from anywhere, and people are, you know, performing music and playing music from all over the world all the time. And does that mean that, you know, a traditional artist, we were in Morocco last year, you know, in Morocco, that music goes away and it's replaced by something else? I mean, how do we think that works in a global, you know, an increasingly global economy, and increasingly global world? I know we don't know the answer to that, but what are your thoughts?
If you look at the band's visit on Broadway, that was a very Middle Eastern music, and it was very popular at 111, I think, Tony's or whatever it is. I think that people are intrigued with all kinds of music. We just had the Biscuits and Banjos Festival here in Durham, and that's with, I've forgotten her name, sorry. Do you know the?
Yeah, I've forgotten. I apologize as well.
Yeah, I'll think of it and put it in the chat. Rhiannon Giddens, thank you. Yeah, she's amazing.
Incredible musician.
Yeah, amazing. And she is going back in history. She's pulling music from all over the world and creating new things, creating opera with it. And so I think that people are just open to new things. I think that music is going to continue to develop like it always has.
Mhm.
Darren, what do you think?
Oh, I mean, could you give me an easier question, please? Um, yeah, so I guess when recording first came onto the scene in like the late 19th century and early 20th century, one of the biggest critics was John Philip Sousa, the most important and popular musicians in the United States. And he just railed against recorded music because he's just like, this is going to take musicians' jobs. It's going to lead to the ruination of music education. And there was just thousands and thousands of words that were spilled about this issue of recording. And some of it ended up being right, but a lot of it ended up not being right. I mean, music education without recording would not be the same that it is today. I mean, it really transformed things. It also created opportunities for other people as well. And so I would say that we are living in unique times, but all times are unique. So in that way, technological change has always been something that has happened with music. And you can go back even further, the development of the piano, the development of the organ, and notation even as its own kind of technology. And so musicians will adapt and continue to make music. Music will not be destroyed in that way. Now, it might look a lot different. And to one of the other questions, is it possible to make a living? That is a big question. Not just streaming, but also AI. And the way that is, we have a lot of students that play in orchestras and studio orchestras for films and TV. That's going to change dramatically. It already has. I know people who have lost jobs because of these changes. And so it's going to depend a lot on how we together do value certain things like the arts, music included. We can hope that there is some support with that, and that there are places in which people will go and see live music and support artists. But it is an open question. It's not something that we can be passive about in that way. So I don't have an answer, except for I will say that we should be intentional about the ways that we consume these things. And we should also think about our attention in general, as again, I mentioned this before, I do think it is our most valuable resource. And so I think we could all sort of think about, all of us, and myself included, should consider how and in what ways we are attentive and in what ways we pay attention to music, and then we make decisions around that.
So one thing, and you just triggered a thought in my mind. One of the, I think, super fascinating things of the 20th century, and it was born of a variety of things, not the least of which was economic disaster, in fairness. But the work that Alan Lomax did, recording, traditional music and traditional sounds, and so many people were, using air quotes for those of you not watching, discovered, these artists in the Delta and other places. And it's just, if you go back and listen to the Alan Lomax recordings and all that work, fascinating stuff. And I mean, is that sort of thing happening now? I mean, are traditional music forms, I mean, we all know we can go online and purchase lots of different interesting things, and lots not that interesting. But what actual, hearing, candidly going back to John Philip Sousa's critique, what about actually hearing people, real people out in the world making music, whether it's in the Delta of the US or Java or anywhere else? I mean, yes, Beth has a view.
There are so many students who come to Duke who want to be a STEM major, but they want to either play in the orchestra or sing opera while they're at Duke. We have so many that we fill up the opera theater program, we fill up the orchestra, there's no room on the stage, playing at very high levels, singing at very high levels. They could be in conservatories, but they're going to be a doctor or something. So I've heard about the death of opera for decades, but it's not dying, it's growing. So.
Darren, last word on that?
Sure, yeah, I would just say that the death of jazz has been proclaimed since 1919, and it continues. So that's the same kind of way. Very quickly, what I will say is that I think it is happening, but it's happening on social media and YouTube and TikTok. It's not happening through Alan Lomax. Alan Lomax was supported by the U.S. government, in part to collect that. Governmental support for the arts is an open question and not something that's being currently supported right now. But that doesn't mean that it won't happen in other capacities. Now, YouTube is owned by Google or Alphabet. So that really is dependent on what is going on there. There's a different type of relationship, but one that doesn't necessarily mean that it will be destroyed. It's different.
Right. Beth, Darren, thank you so much. Eli, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you so much, Alan. And thank you, Alan, Beth, and Darren for a great session, and to our audience for joining us. Today's session was recorded and will be posted to the Duke Alumni Lifelong Learning YouTube channel. Be on the lookout for a follow-up email with links highlighted today. Links are being thrown in the chat, and you will get those via email as well. This is the last session in our Music Appreciation Series, and what a series it's been. Keep an eye out on our website and the Forever Learning newsletter for more information about our fall Forever Learning Institute themes. We look forward to seeing you at the next Forever Learning Institute. Thank you all so much.